Heather Hogan, and called The Ethics of Storytelling. So it's a continuation of that conversation, talking about how we tell stories about LGBTQ+. What does that look like? How do we hold media makers responsible? Are they even responsible? Do we have a right to hold them responsible? And that is what we're talking about today. So I'm Gretchen Ellis. I'm a managing editor of analysis and a contributor at the nerdy media analysis website, The Fundamentals. We're at booth 130. I write about Star Wars, Steven Universe, queer young adult fiction. I also review Wyatt Earp when it is in season. And I'm also in the process of revising my first novel, which is a queer, multiracial, neurodiverse sci-fi novel, and will hopefully be querying agents later this year.
I'm Elizabeth Bridges. My Twitter people have named me Prof, so that you might not know my name, but I'm Prof. And I am an actual professor at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee, where I teach courses in comparative literature and the humanities program and gender and sexuality studies. And I've written quite a bit academically about fandom-related topics, media-related topics, and I also have a blog at uncannyvalley.us where it actually ended up in Mo Ryan's article last year, which was shocked the hell out of me. Not last year, but 2 years ago. And so I don't know what happened after that. I had an audience of like 6 people, and then it exploded.
So thank you, Mo Ryan.
Yeah. I'm Maya. I play golf professionally, so different side of what these guys do. But I also have spent a lot of time working in Hollywood. I worked for the Mark Gordon Company, which produces Grey's Anatomy, and a bunch of shows of that type. And then I worked for a small independent film company that did Waitress. My claim to fame is that I got to work on the Broadway adaptation, so my small victory. I, through my undergrad career, and, now I'm actually considering going to get a PhD in gender and sexuality studies, but through my whole undergrad career, I wrote a lot and studied a lot about, representation in film and media, and continue to tweet ad nauseum about it. But yeah, and actually, I think in my undergrad, we played against Rhodes a lot.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, Claremont Mechanic.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, so we played with you guys. Oh my god.
Sister institution.
Yeah.
So I have to follow pro golfer. That's what we're You're very casual about that. I'm Bridget Liszewski. I'm the editor-in-chief at the TV Junkies, and we do a lot of Canadian TV coverage as well as U.S. Television, and we do a lot of Wyatt Earp specifically. That's kind of what we're known for. We do a lot of Wyatt Earp coverage. And then I'm also just recently the co-host of a new podcast called The Feminist Thrill Joys, where where it's just 3 women, and we say we like to take a break from smashing the patriarchy to celebrate the feministy things that we love. So we just are kind of shouting about things that we love on that podcast. So. And my 2 co-hosts are both queer women, so we do end up talking a lot about queer-related content on that.
So, as I said, this is a continuation of a conversation we had last year. In last year's panel, we talked about how, because stories shape how we perceive ourselves and our place in the world and others, because that is true, people will tell you it's not, but it's a fact. The stories that we tell and the stories we engage in shape how we think about ourselves and the world. Because that is true, there's tremendous responsibility in being a content creator. Because you are literally participating in that and shaping how people think. And you talked a little bit about the idea of the artistic, the kind of auteur model that we've had so far. Just you have the showrunner, the one person who just dictates everything, and the problems with that.
Well, the model of the artist that we have really developed in the Renaissance when single artists started signing their works, because before that, it was all for the glory of God. It was religious art. And individual artists became these content creators, if you will. Mm-hmm. And we have kind of inherited that idea of the artist, which we still think of as art being something created by one person. And there are plenty of artists who take that to heart and kind of take on this identity of the auteur. Hitchcock would be sort of the prime example of that. But anybody who kind of takes the credit for a larger collaborative work, which TV and film definitely are. You know, you can't work without a writer and a producer and a director and story editors and a writing team. And so a lot of times that's a really patriarchal model of art. But it is kind of the model that we're all working with as a culture. And so one of the things that we talked about last year was that the shows that see themselves as more collaborative tend to be the ones that are also more inclusive. And we used One Day at a Time as a really good example of that, where they really feature heavily their artistic team, their writing team. And I think they just published a picture the other day, actually, and you can look at the picture and know this is a diverse writing team, and these people are coming from a bunch of different communities, and they're going to be able to speak for those communities a little better than your straight male white guy taking all the credit, auteur type character.
Right. And the final piece of context for you all is we talked about we can only know the intent of a work of art as it's mediated through that piece of art itself. And frequently, the impact is more important even than intent. And especially when it's negative impact. If there's like a trope, like with, the elephant in the room, with the 100, regardless of how that was intended, the impact of that was so tremendous that impact supersedes any kind of intent in terms of the way we have to talk about it.
Well, and in approaching teaching literature, for example, I talk a lot about the sort of negligible aspect of artistic intent or authorial intent. And the way that I do that is I always write this pithy thing on the board where I go, impact greater than intent. And what that is really a work, once it's released into the public, it belongs to the public. And how they interpret it is how they interpret it. And everybody's interpretation of a work is valid. The author has one opinion about the work that they created, but they don't have more authority, if you will, than audience members in terms of determining what that work means, what it means to an audience, how it impacts the audience. And I think, Jason Rothenberg being a really good example of really missing that point. Because in a series of interviews kind of on his pseudo-apology tour that he did after In the Wake of 307, and let's face it, it was a pseudo-apology tour, where he talked to a bunch of different websites, and it was really clear that he never understood that his intent in creating the work had nothing to do with how it impacted audiences. And as far as I could tell, he never got even a tiny piece of that.
Right. So all that brings us to responsibility. So how does responsibility extend beyond just not killing off a character? Because it's a good bar, but it's a pretty low bar. You should be able to just step over that bar without lifting your foot off the ground. So that's what we wanted to talk about today. Was things like subtext relationships. What's the line between baiting and subtext? How are they responsible for handling that? Other than not burying your gaze, other than that, what are some other bars?
Where do we go from there?
Where do we go from there to just please don't kill us?
Yeah, where do we go from not dead?
Please don't kill us off.
Well, the hypersexualization of queer women, and also just primarily our the depictions of queer women that we see on television right now are femme and passing as straight, and the fact is the majority of us don't look like that. I mean, not the majority, I'm just there's a lot of us who don't look like that.
Right, I mean this room.
And to have that be also the hypersexual, making queer women look as if they can pass for straight kind of plays into the straight male fantasy that queerness for women isn't a valid sexuality, that we can be turned.
It's mutable.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that poses a huge problem when, in the wider sense, because when we go out in the world, if you're at a bar or something, a dude someone unknowing, probably a dude, will come out to you and be like, yeah, I can change that. Like,
Challenges.
but it poses, not only does it make it hard for queer women in the audience to relate to these characters, it also creates this really awful like idea or assumption of what queerness is for women, or what a queer woman looks like. So I think like challenging the idea that a queer woman is like any femme woman wearing a motorcycle jacket and,
Or police uniform.
Yeah, because if I start thinking of like the shows that do it really well, and like I'm sitting here and I'm like, yeah, Legends of Tomorrow's like that's what Sarah and Ava look like Why Can't Maya Earp, and I'm thinking like the only one I can like One Day at a Time does do a really good job of that. I'm not doing that, so yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they do a really good job of a lot of things.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the opposite side of that is you have the like sanitizing of like queer romance and sex, where like you'll have like if it's a show that has, you know, straight couples as well, like they'll get like passionate, like or like wake up the next morning while they're like draped in, you know,
Conspicuously covering certain areas.
right, like or half naked. But like when it comes to a queer romance, you'll have like, oh, she's wearing her shirt the next day. I guess they had sex.
Or if there is a sex scene or something alluding to a sex scene, like they definitely have their bras still on, and or a tank top.
And it's a lot of like soft, it's like across the room, soft touching. Yeah,
Or like
over
you
the
can
camera
really see
lens.
it. Yeah, you can really see it.
Yeah, it's like
Only past the window.
Or even going back to your point, it's all like they could be very like, even their underwear is very like
Victoria's
sexy.
Secret.
Yeah, Victoria's Secret girls' underwear, and I'm like, do you know?
Like, have you visited the Tomboy X booth?
Right? Like, sports bras, anyone? Like, not a bra, anyone? Like, which is a bra that I've had for 10 years and then wear when I'm doing laundry?
Okay, I'm straight and think the same thing when I see that.
To be fair.
Right. It's
But
just,
no,
yeah.
yes.
it's also like, I mean, not, yeah, and like the depictions of sex scenes is also really irresponsible because queer people just don't have sex education. So for the most part, a lot of us are like we end up finding ourselves like learning about what sex is through movies and TV shows. I know, like,
And fan fiction.
I mean, I know for me when I like got, well, South of Nowhere was really big for me, and then like when I was in college, the L word, I like was a late bloomer on catching up with that. But the L word, but still, all of these things were not like that. I don't have sex like that. Like,
Will we ever even get a kissing scene where it's properly lit?
No.
I cannot think of a lot of examples where the lighting is such that you can actually see both people.
yeah.
And
Why not?
I know.
well, I was also thinking about on Riverdale recently. Sorry, I won't
Oh,
spoil who was involved in case people aren't caught up on that. But
Catch up on it. The Carrie musical is next week.
okay, sorry, I'm Riverdale trash. But yeah, and so that scene was kind of interestingly lit because there was a film, and they were standing in front of a screen where a film was being projected.
Oh my
but it
goodness.
was.
I like kind of loved it. Well, there's like I kind of loved it, but it's interesting that you brought up that episode because I think that plays into our like discussion fully because it involves. I'm so sorry to spoil anyone here.
Cover your ears if you haven't seen it.
But it involves conversion therapy.
Yes.
Which one of my friends works on Riverdale, and I remember when I saw, like, when they first introduced the storyline, I was like, are you kidding? Like, I was like, I can't do this. Like, this is trigger. Like, what is this? Like, I'm super worried about, like, where you're going to take this and everything. And then still not super satisfied with what they did, but it was a really interesting way. I don't know.
It was kind of about a cheerleader scenario. Yeah.
But also, like, it was kind of nice to see all of these queer kids get liberated.
Yeah.
So,
interesting episode.
yes.
But another, sort of these things where it gets either sanitized and people get desexualized, or completely desexualized and kind of turned into martyr figures, which is sometimes where we get into RBYG. And what's really interesting is that in the history of minority communities represented on film, there kind of is always that phase. The Defiant Ones, for instance, was a pretty early film featuring a black male lead, Sidney Poitier, and then I forget who the white guy was, but anyway, they make these characters into martyrs. So this is considered like good representation, and then we're like, but dead, right? Yeah, and so for a cause, but still, and then. So there are different ways of sidelining, reducing screen time. Right. I think we've all seen that happen. Sanford's. And then sort of cutting off a romantic storyline from the rest of the storyline, sort of making it a side thing.
Right. Which again, Sanford's. Like, suddenly now that they're canonical, they didn't participate, especially in season 2, they just didn't participate in the main storyline. They would have their own separate thing that they did.
And so we got like 2 minutes of Sanders at the end of an episode. Right,
or like interspersed throughout. And I mean, those are the kinds of things that send the message that like our stories aren't worthy.
We're literally marginal.
Right, yeah, we're literally marginal. We're just like brownie points. And like we don't participate in like larger conversations in society. Like once we have a romance, we can just kind of go happily off and like exist in the corner somewhere. And like we don't get to still be a part of like the main story as like the heroes the way everyone else gets to be.
I think the one show that I've seen where the queer character has been heavily involved with the main storyline was Happy Endings. Anybody?
I'm not familiar with that.
Watch Happy Endings.
The old ensemble, yeah.
Yeah, because Max was a non-stereotypical gay guy, kind of beat all of the stereotypes that you would have of a gay man, and also was treated as, like, his sexuality and everything about him was just treated as it was just like he was another part of the group.
Like incidental.
Yeah, it was just like he was there, and it was incidental, and it was still acknowledged. Like, there were still storylines about, like, there's an entire episode about Max trying to understand what his gay subculture is, which was hilarious, and really well done, because it, like, even though it was, like, it's like a comedy, and it's a comedic episode, it still really tackled, like, that idea, and confronted that idea of, like, oh yeah, like, there are a lot of gay subcultures, and sometimes finding what your, like, queer identity is really difficult. And at the end of the day, like, you know, like, what does that mean? Like, where does your found family come into all of that?
Right.
But then that's, like, only one example, so.
Something that I was thinking a lot about when you were talking about, sex education and getting the younger viewers and stuff. I have 2 young daughters, and I think about this a lot with them, because we're now seeing shows like Andy Mack and the Disney Channel do these stories about coming out, and it's really, like, I'm like, well, how are my kids going to react to this? They have no reaction. They're just like, this is fine. These 2 people like each other, whatever. They don't think something. It's the adults that are putting this onto the children, whereas my kids are seeing it. Or I had a friend who was watching Supergirl season 2, and she's like, you didn't tell me Alex's story gets gay. And I'm like, well, who cares, number one? And I was like, my kids didn't even have a reaction. Like, she's like, well, I just worry about the kids. I'm like, why? The kids... I was like, my kids had no reaction. So I was like, what is the problem? But I think, like, the more we can get it into the younger viewers, because it's like the old saying, like, we're all taught to hate. We're all then taught that this is something that's bad because we're not seeing it when we're younger. So I think it's shows like Andy Mack doing stuff like that. Right. We can get that to younger audiences also.
Steven Universe.
We talked a lot about, we kind of talked about something on the same lines in our Queer Asian panel earlier today, that in Asian representation, or like Asian people tend to have like a lot of internalized colonialism, and a lot of these anti-gay sentiments, or like anti-queer sentiments in Asian cultures is actually a byproduct of colonialization. Like, I'm speaking for Indian culture, like, we're queer as fuck. Like, everybody is very queer. Like, Hinduism is a very queer religion, and like the legislation that like outlaws queerness in India is a byproduct of a colonial law. And I think that feeds into, like, being aware of that and how that plays into how we represent or how we're teaching our kids, like how my parents are teaching me about things. I think feeds into this idea of, like, the older generation trying to, like, have
real people sometimes do horrible things to each other. I know I do horrible things to people I love. Because I'm a person and that's what happens. Which is why I think so much has to be own story. Like, or just, yeah, we'll get into this a little bit later, but like that was something I wanted to like mention as something that like I think creators need to be aware of, that like you can go too far onto the other side of like making characters so perfect that they're not allowed to exist in the human realm. Now they're not people anymore. And that like affects the way people like think and relate to us. Like, I mean, so, and relatedly, writing flat or, you know, overly stereotypical, like, you know, or even the other side of like, oh, this character is clearly coded as butch, let's make them straight. Because that's, like, look how edgy we're being. Like, you can go too far the other way. And I think it's what you were saying earlier about the overly femme. Yeah. Like, there are just certain stereotypes. Yeah, like certain stereotypes that writers want, that like showrunners who might not know any better, like, are like, oh, well, like, gay women must just be really femme. So, like, well, like, that's appealing to audiences, so, like, I'll put that stereotype in there because people will like it.
I mean, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think it's, well, along those lines, I feel like showrunners who don't know about what, you know, like, the varied spectrum of queerness looks like will tend to go through to the stereotypes. But that was making me wonder, like, there aren't a lot, I don't know what I'm trying to figure out what I'm trying to say, but like the information on like queerness for women, I feel like isn't very accessible to people who are not queer. So how do we make it more accessible, like our experiences more accessible, so that like like white cis male showrunners are like, oh, okay, like I can go to like X or whatever and try to figure out, where I feel like a lot of them have that hallmark for gay male representation, and they can go back to the original Queer Eye and go to Queer as Folk, and there are like so many more there's so much more information out there for especially cis gay male representation, which is why I feel like it tends to be a little, not completely, but a little bit more nuanced than female ones.
That's a really good point. Yeah.
And well, I think that your point about making these characters appealing to straight audiences, I mean, we all know the thing about the male gaze, the article from Laura Mulvey about how cameras are inherently a male eye. And so I think that, you know, a lot of the representation we see is made on that basis. And what's interesting is that also we as audience members, no matter what gender, sexuality might be, we're so used to that kind of lens of, and I think a really good exemplary moment of that is right at the beginning of the movie Lost in Translation, where the camera just goes over Scarlett Johansson's panty-clad hip. And that's the beginning of the movie. And, you know, that's like a primo example of this idea of the male gaze, but I feel like that's at work in most of the media that we see, almost all of it, as a matter of fact. And so when you see something that differs from that, it's really very noticeable. And Wyatt Earp is a good example of a story that does not do that as much as a lot of media productions that we see. And I think part of that is because there are so many women involved in the production of that show. But it is really noticeable, and I think that a lot of us really gravitate towards material that doesn't do that.
Right.
And like Carmilla, for example, where it's just a very objective lens because it's usually just a static camera. And, you know, and again, that is something that's very different than what we're used to seeing. And so, you know, a lot of people gravitate towards that, whereas, you know, the sort of conventional, everyday, typical camera work that we see is very much from a male viewpoint.
Right.
Often literally.
Yeah, often. So a couple other things we wanted to, like, issues that, like, bars we need to set. Things like tokenism. J.K. Rowling. I'm not
That's super tokenism.
right. Well, it's because it's one of those things where it's like it's after the fact, and then also then deleted when it came time to actually like tell the story that was in that timeline. It's like, oh wait, no, never mind. We're not actually going to do that.
That's just like erasure.
Right? Yes. It's like
yeah.
if you're gonna make him like one, you should have made him explicitly gay. You should have made Dumbledore explicitly gay in the books. Like, but if you're going to like after the fact say, oh wait, he was gay all along, you don't let in to say no, never mind. We're not going to tell that story.
But that's what I mean by authorial opinion, too.
Right.
Because, again, her saying Dumbledore is gay is basically just her reading of her own text, which we can do our own reading of that text and decide whether if we think so or not. But if it's not explicitly in the text, then, especially if you're the author, I don't think you get to make that claim.
Right.
But then to go ahead and make that claim and then not include it in the film, I think is really was off the chain marginalizing.
Yeah, I was very frustrated by that. Other things like straight washing has become an issue recently in recent media. We have characters that are this again, like with J.K. Rowling, you have issues with Black Panther, which that I have mixed feelings about. There is, like with what happened with Valkyrie, there are, both of the actors have said they pushed for the representation and there was filming actually done that may not have been included. And that's always a difficult subject for me to think about because Tessa Thompson, I'm really grateful for her and for what she did, and also for Taika Waititi and being let's try as hard as we can to make Valkyrie's bisexuality canonical, and then you have the bigwigs who are no, don't. And I think from what you can tell, something similar might have happened to Black Panther.
Yeah, I think going up against Disney is somewhat impossible at this point.
Right.
Not that it will be impossible forever, but seeing that Taika and Tessa fought for that, fought to make her bisexuality more explicit in the film, and that Tessa was okay, if it's not going to be in there, I'm going to spend the entire press tour, talking about how is, I think, really, really awesome, and, a good thing, the least that could have happened from that shitty situation, and I'm really grateful that it did. Right. I think I just read about the Black Panther stuff. I did not know that much about it, but, that feels more like a, studio influence,
right,
because everybody on it, and I love Ryan Coogler, and I feel he would be the first person to be let's make things queer, let's have better representation, let's be really honest to the characters. And I think my biggest thing with, I love Black Panther, but my biggest thing with it was you could definitely feel that Disney's hand was in it, and they didn't let Coogler kind of do what he, make it the thing that he could have made it.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know, that just brings up the weird thing of how do we show these monopolized studios that putting queer content is only going to benefit the movie and benefit the stories.
We are a valid audience.
Yeah.
We are an audience that is eager for that, and we'll throw lots of money. If you give us the time, if you give us the space, we'll be make it, please. If you make it gay, I'll give you my money. I don't have a lot of it, but I will give it to you if you make it gay.
One thing that we also have to consider is the fact that that stuff actually got cut from actual film that was shot, and a lot of times that's a studio thing because they're thinking about the international market, exactly, and how the film will sell in a place like, say, China, for example,
Which is an interesting question of responsibility of what should financial concerns play into a sense of responsibility? What responsibility do they have to tell the story versus tell the story to make money? Because that's a huge question that a lot of people have. Rebecca Sugar, I feel is one of the few people who got, I think she got pushback for Steven Universe that was well, we're not going to be able to air this in Russia. And she, my headcanon is that she was just I don't give a fuck. Make it as gay as I like it. So, like you have, it's a valid question to be like, do we have to consider, when we're talking about like showrunner responsibility, do we have to consider like the responsibility to shareholders of like how much money they need to make? And
I think you are seeing that though in like fans like of Wynonna Earp, because I think sci-fi has truly seen you guys want to make this show, and they have seen like the power, like you said, take all my money, do whatever. Like the Earpers are everywhere, like they're traveling all over the country to these cons. We are spending lots of money. We are like hitting up their social media. So I do think like a big network like Sci-Fi is seeing that now and seeing like the power of that. But so it's like you have to do it. But I do agree, like just saying like, well, the fans are aware that this character was queer, if that doesn't take the place of actual representation on screen.
Right. So
That's not good enough yet.
no, it's not. So what? We've talked a lot about like issues. So what do we think responsibility looks like? What would like a content creator having the responsibility to tell our stories in a way that is not harmful to our community? Like, what does that look like?
Has anybody been watching Black Lightning?
Yes.
Yes. Because I feel they haven't told a lot of Anissa's story yet, but that show is also very young. But they made it front and center in the first couple of episodes even. And then she also has a girlfriend, or are they girlfriends yet, or is it kind of
Asian representation?
right? Yeah. So Grace is
Bisexual
in there.
explicit
Right.
bisexual Asian
Yeah, they
representation.
said the word. They said the
Yes.
word in the episode. And so, that's some really promising material there.
Right.
I would like to see Grace in the show a little bit more, because this could go a little bit in the direction of kind of de-emphasizing Anissa's sexuality and also not having Grace in there at all.
Right.
But I'm hoping that will kind of change a little bit as the series evolves. But I would say that is an example of something where they've done it right and where it is kind of a pretty incidental aspect of the show.
Right.
And it's just sort of organic.
Yes.
And I think that's something that's one reason I think a lot of fans responded to Lexa so much when that was before the thing happened, but they revealed her sexuality in such an incidental kind of organic way in the show, such that it was definitely there, it was highlighted, it was in there, but it had only certain elements to do with the character.
It didn't define who she was.
Yeah, we already knew who she was before they introduced that.
Right.
And I think that's one of the reasons that we responded so well to that. And I feel like Black Lightning has done that. One Day at a Time certainly did that.
Yep.
And I think to Wyatt Earp as well, just sort of having a character who is busy doing lots of things, and that this happens to be their sexuality. And so something that I've really noticed at this ClexaCon, and I think in kind of the fandom world in general, especially over the last several months, is there is more of a sense of optimism, I think. And, that was definitely not there 2 years ago, not much there a year ago, but it's really starting to grow. And I have to think that it's because we have younger creators coming in who have grown up in a world where this is not that big of a deal, and making content that corresponds to that. I mean, do we need more? Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
And do we need actual queer people in these rooms creating this material, or at least consulting on it? Absolutely. But I think we are starting to see a little bit of the fruit of the outpouring of just rage, frankly, after the spring of, you coined that term, the spring of slaughter.
Yeah, the spring slaughter.
I actually quote that in my academic article.
I mean, I feel bad saying like that's awesome, but because it was like that spring of like the spring of 2017. Yeah, 2016 was just left and everywhere.
But I mean, the fact that it happened so much and in such a way that even straight audiences had to take notice, and then Mo's article, and then all these other news outlets picking up that material, and then it being in the GLAAD report, and then being tweeted by UN Women and all kinds of that audiences really took notice of that, and they started even straight audiences started to say, "Hey, what the fuck?"
Right.
And seriously, I mean, I have straight friends, and I told them what was going on, and then they started noticing it in the media too. And they're like, "Did you see this?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, I know about that." but and so they started to realize, wow, this is really a thing that's happening, and we didn't even notice it happening. And I think even a lot of queer audiences weren't fully aware of the extent of BYG. But that's actually the article. It's a genealogy of barrier gays and queerbaiting. dating back to sodomy laws in like the 17 and 1800s. But anyway, so the point being, I think we have had an impact, and I think that the people who responded, I would say positively to what happened after 307, really did cause there to be this group of people taking notice. Oh, we actually do need to be more responsible about these depictions,
Right.
Because we haven't had anything like those numbers of BYGs since then. I mean, we've had some, but it's not like every week there's like 3.
Right.
Which is really what was happening for a while. I mean, on broadcast TV, 40% or 43% of lesbian and bisexual women got killed. This was not counting cable and streaming, but just on broadcast TV.
Right.
And that's really telling. I mean, if 43% of, say, straight male characters disappeared off of television, all of a sudden people would notice.
Yeah, I have a friend that's a TV writer, and she has said once that I always think of. She said the goal is one day to have so many queer characters on TV that if one dies, it's just like it's just how we are.
Exactly.
Jenny on the L word.
And that's the thing as well. I mean, that's the thing because we notice every single one because there are so few characters, and because. For some reason, this seems like a great story move to create this drama by killing one of us.
Which is why I think TV being collaborative in nature is such a huge, they have such an opportunity because they can get rooms like one day at a time and bring in authentic and diverse voices, and you can then have all those voices into the one product, and you don't have like the main showrunner, just their voice. So.
Right.
You brought up what does responsibility look like?
Right. Yeah.
So another example, in addition to Black Lightning, of shows that I think are treating queer female sexuality really well, is Fresh Off the Boat.
Yes.
There's a baby gay storyline in there that has done. I've been loving it so much because not only is it doing this kind of she's gay now, but it's also kind of talking about the cultural assumptions from Asian families about queerness in a really fucking awesome way.
And hilarious.
Yeah, and Constance Wu.
Yeah,
the
she's
best. But doing it in this way where it's it's just so honest and authentic to what that experience not that experience is representative of everybody's, but it's very honest to that particular experience, which I think for me makes it so much more special because it's not trying to be everybody's is like this, or it's not falling into trying to make a coming out story incredibly tragic. It's actually building bonds off of it and making it a commentary on gender fuckage and that. I think what spoke to me the most is that it was kind of finding the solidarity between minority groups that not always exists. I think Asian cultures are sometimes weird about queerness, and to see that there's this big friendship between Eddie and I can't remember her name. Nicole.
Yeah.
Is really cool, and the fact that Jessica is such a mom to them and it hasn't changed any of the dynamic is so heartening to me because it's even though that wasn't my experience, I've had a very fortunate experience with my family. It's just so cool to see that hey, look, really good things can happen with this ethnic kind of queer blend, and it doesn't always have to be the tiger moms or the various stereotypes that exclude other minority groups from different ethnicities.
Right.
I like that you brought up that example because they have portrayed that so seamlessly in the show that I kind of forgot it was on there.
Yeah. No, it's done so well.
Yeah, but I mean that's a really great example, and I think when we were discussing this panel before getting together here in front of you guys, it was remarkable to me how many more examples we were able to come up with. Because last year, One Day at a Time was our only thing that we could be well, they're doing it right, but who else?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It was that and again, Steven Universe. I love Steven Universe, if you can tell. But it really was. It was 2 shows that we were I guess these are doing it well. And none of it was drama.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was children's programming and a sitcom. I mean, it really normalization to me, what responsibility looks like normalization, and that's something we've talked about multiple times about it's the like, oh right, that happened.
Yeah.
There's no like fanfare made about it. It's just as normal as any other thing, because it is.
Because
Like,
we all live in lives
right?
where we interact with people in a
Right,
normal
and
way.
it's not a big deal. And like one thing that's like really important to me, and I'm a fiction writer, and so I was having a conversation with an actual published author about how he wrote characters so well. I was like, how do you do this? Because of like, I mean, he's a straight white guy. I was like, I've read your books. How do you as like a straight white male write characters that are so like believable and so like representative? And the advice he gave to me was, like, as I've said, it was write it like a person. No, you can't write a stereotype. You can't sit down and say, I'm going to tell the story of like a queer black woman. Like, you can't do that. You sit down to write the story of Anissa. You write Anissa's story. You tell a person's story. And the more specific you get, the more universal it is that people will be able to relate to it. And it sounds counterintuitive, but like you were saying about Fresh Off the Boat, was the more specific details that you can give to someone, the more they're going to be relatable to a larger number of people. And that, to me, is what responsibility, that's one of the biggest things about responsibility, is like, write us like you are writing any other human being. Because we are human beings, like we are people, but not all of us are the same.
Right.
You know, like, I love Star Wars and could talk about it forever, but not everyone does. So, like, I'm not a stereotype. Like, we all love different media, we all love different things, we all have different backgrounds, and you give them specific details that may not apply to everybody, but, like, who cares? Who cares if, like, every person doesn't like Star Wars? If I write a character who likes Star Wars and, like, not everyone has to like Star Wars to like that character, because it's not about, like, those things. It's about their personhood. We identify with people that are fleshed out, with characters that have depth and nuance and, like, interest to them. And I know, like, we probably won't be able to get into subtext. But that's actually why subtext is appealing to me, because subtext typically draws on those, like, these are two really interesting female characters, and I just want to, like, push them together, like, but that, like, to me, like, so much of what happens is creators sit down and are like, oh, right, I've got to write a lesbian. How do I write a lesbian? And I'm like, you don't sit down to write a lesbian. You sit down to write a character. And they, like, who they are attracted to becomes a piece of them, but not the entirety of who they are.
I like, which reminds me, I like what they're doing, like, right now in Jane the Virgin.
Oh,
yeah.
Yes.
Same thing, it was like, just stay true to that character, and yes, fans were, like, reading her as queer, but, and I don't think they listened really to the fans, but they basically just listened to Petra, and they leaned in, and they didn't say, oh, hey, well, we already have this gay person in this one, so we're over a certain number. Yeah, they just, like, went with it and did it, and I think my friend Valerie, like, always shouts, like, there was one episode where there was, like, 7 queer women in it, and she was like, I know.
That's really exceeding
Yeah.
the limit quota.
Yeah.
That's too much.
And I just felt like they just stayed true to that character and just kept writing her, and they didn't say,
Right.
like, we have enough queers we can't anymore.
Well, queer people do know other queer people, so.
What? Same thing as on Crazy Ex-Girlfriend.
No, TV tells me you only come with by yourself all the time.
All of my friends are straight. Literally all of them. I know. Are you guys gay? What? Gay what?
But Crazy Ex-Girlfriend does a similar thing, because you have Pete Gardner's character, who's bi, and has that amazing bisexual song. And then now you have Valencia and her girlfriend, who just, like, surprised she's gay now. Like, it was just, like, I
Brooklyn
remember...
Nine-Nine?
Yes.
Brooklyn Nine-Nine, another one?
Yeah, and it's so cool to see, like, these characters where it's like, no, like, that makes, like, I mean, watching Valencia have a girlfriend, I was like, no, that makes sense. Like, that like, fits with who she is. It's like, I just want to see her be happy, and if this person makes her happy, then, like, cool. Like, that's perfect. That's all I want.
All of these examples that we're citing are things from the last 2 years, or even just the last year.
Right.
And that, to me, is a real signal that something we've been saying has been working.
Right.
You know, and I feel like we just need to keep saying it, and I mean that in terms of both the people with a large mouthpiece and people who are just fans on Twitter.
Right.
You know, because
Right.
that stuff, like every little bit of that adds up, and I think that's something that's really important, and it has made an impact.
Right, because the media companies may not hold them responsible, but like we as fans can push for that responsibility ourselves. Following your story is another one. Like that's kind of what we're saying. Is like allow the story to evolve organically. If you're a creator, and if you see two characters that have chemistry, and like that's appealing. I was also thinking Black Sails, but that one, the big elephant in the room. But like Black Sails is another one, or even Korosami. Those were both like stories. Like Max and Anne wasn't originally intended to be as positive as it was. But they started following the story and were like, no, this should be like actually romantic and not like manipulative, and this should be a story about them like healing together. And you had that with Korosami too, where they were just like, oh, this makes sense of the story that I'm telling, rather than like trying to force your vision for what one's vision for what a story should look like onto it to allow the story to evolve. And that gets back to what you were saying earlier about that like auteur, like, I am the storyteller, it's my story, fuck off if you don't like it. Paraphrasing.
Not really, I mean.
So, like, yeah, all that to say, like, responsibility is important, and we get to participate in that. Like, we don't have to wait for, like, the companies to hold them accountable. Because the more we say, no thanks, like, thanks but no thanks on that, that isn't what we want. We want something that looks more like this. The more we do that, the more we tell them what we want, the more likely it is that that will be heard and make its way into our media. I think as we're seeing, like, I can't believe a year ago, like, the change between the panel we had a year ago and today
It's so
is
different.
huge.
Yeah, there's so much more, like in all across the board mediums, like, so many things that have been made or are in development, and like the one thing that I'm thinking of is Brown Girls, the like web series that HBO picked up to series, which is like 0 to 500 really to get an HBO pickup, but like shows like that where it's just like about two non-white women, two brown women of different ethnicities, and one of them is queer, and then just like what they're doing. It's like girls, but hopefully not problematic. Is really cool, and that like people, not even just like, you know, premium cable networks are giving these queer shows a chance, but like you have Champions on NBC, which like I know backed by Mindy Kaling, but hey, it's like a mixed race gay kid. Like that's what the show is about, and that's like the best part about the show. And even though there's like some stereotype stuff in play there, it's just like a well done character, and we're seeing like more queer kids on TV, which is like cute. Like you brought up Indy Mac.
Is anybody watching Good Girls?
Yes.
There's a non-binary gender non-conforming child on that show.
Yeah.
And again, it's just kind of something that's introduced and not really. I mean, there's a certain storyline of like the two parents having two different opinions about how to respond, but which is very realistic,
right?
But again, it's just a thing that is introduced in the show in an organic way, and I really can't believe that all of these examples, and I think there are probably even more.
Yep. The Other Love Story, I will push for The Other Love Story, that's on YouTube. It is beautiful. I see Morgan back there smiling, she knows exactly, like, it's a great, like, beautiful little web series about two Indian women falling in love, and it's gorgeous and makes me cry. Star Wars has canonical lesbian in the comics. I will push for Dr. Aphra. She's my favorite. I love her. And like, yeah, just like even the fact that I could say like there are gay characters in Star Wars now. Let's get them on the screen. But like, yeah.
We're kind of at time at this point, and I think we could entertain maybe one question if anybody has something.
Had a question over here?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, can you queerbait without intent to queerbait? Because it seems to be that you need intent to be baiting someone versus people just reading like subtext between two actors or something.
That really depends on your definition of queerbaiting, and if anybody follows my Twitter, I've gotten a large argument with someone recently about about this. But yeah, there are different operative definitions of queerbaiting. When I was researching for the article that I wrote, almost every different person had a slightly different nuance of their definition of queerbaiting. I think in some cases it is intentional. Jane Espenson, who worked on Buffy, who worked on is working on the Once Upon a Time.
Right.
She was talking about intentionally queerbaiting as kind of something to throw a bone to the audience when the network really won't let you do what you want to do. But then on the other hand, I think sort of the classic definition of queerbaiting is completely unintentional because it's really just based on the audience's reading of looks and glances, and then maybe the showrunners becomes privy to that and starts playing that up a little bit. But yeah, that's a whole other topic. But we only have a certain amount of time here. There was one more question back here.
It was very similar.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, if you want to continue these conversations with us, we're all around the con all weekend, and I'm really glad to see everybody here. I see some repeat faces from our panel this one is a continuation of, and so thanks everybody for coming. Enjoy the con.
Yes.